I'm here to talk to you guys about today is how bright the future really can look when we take a strengths-based approach to supporting the autistic girls in our lives. So really quick, just wanted to introduce myself. So I am a mental health counselor. I'm also a career counselor, and I do some advocacy as well. Since I spent 15 years in the corporate side of things, I do a lot of work in terms of educating folks about the importance of neurodiversity in the workplace. And all of this stemmed from the fact that I've got my own journey with neurodiversity, I fit into the world and how I experience things, and also raising three daughters, the oldest of which is autistic. So my big focus is helping autistic women understand how their strengths, their unique perspective of the world is so critical for us to have a healthy and functioning and wonderful society. So I do that in my one-on-one work. And then in terms of advocacy, it really is more of looking at that systemic perspective of where are there problematic barriers? Where are we unnecessarily burdening autistic women instead of getting to really experience their incredible strengths? And so that is the work that I do with marketing agencies as well as with other mental health care providers. And I operate from the perspective that every single neurodivergent girl is worthy and that our world is so much better with them in it. And I'm sure that you guys share that perspective as well. So goal today, the group here at the Autism Community Network asked for me to share a little bit about some of the unique experiences that specifically autistic girls and women face in navigating a world, a society that caters to neurotypical people, and sharing a little bit about what the outlook is for autistic girls when we take a strengths-based approach to their development and support. The first thing I wanted to start with is what's called the neurodiversity paradigm, which for those of y'all that are familiar with it, you can put earmuffs on for a little bit. But for those that this might be new to, I wanted to share it at the very beginning of the conversation because it is the framework. It is a very clear paradigm that has been documented in the 90s is when it really started. And it's starting to take more conversation around it. And it helps kind of ground us in what are the ways that we can be most supportive based approach. So the first is that neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. So this isn't like Santa Claus, like, do I believe in neurodiversity or not? This is what it is. It is documented not only with humans, but there's also been research in other species. There's actually a really cool study about bees, the neurodivergent bees, and the important in the health and longevity of the beehive. So this is something that exists, and this is the number one principle of the foundation of neurodivergent affirming care. The second is that the idea that there is one normal or healthy type of brain or mind or a right style of neurocognitive functioning is a culturally constructed fiction. So what this means is that there is this idea that someone is like neurotypical, or that doesn't mean that they are better than someone that is neurodivergent. So that's the same thing as practicing from the perspective that there is no one normal ethnicity, gender, or culture. The third piece is that the neurodiversity paradigm does not reject the narratives of how problematic and complicated it can be to live as a neurodivergent person. Okay, so we're not trying to gloss over the fact that oftentimes the experience of neurodivergence is quite difficult in the world. And it's not because necessarily that neurodivergent folks are less than, that they are defective, that they are broken. It's more the way that I said it a little bit earlier, which is that it simply is just harder to navigate a world that caters to more neurotypical experiences. That it can be harder to find care when you have experienced trauma, that it may be harder to enter a hospital after you've had an accident or been hurt when the blaring fluorescent lights are overwhelming and overstimulating your brain, and therefore making it harder for you to verbalize what it is that you've been through, right? So these three things, for the folks that are taking the time to be on these coffee and connections calls, you may be like, yeah, so what? Duh. But this is actually like a really important part of the education that's happening, as it relates to folks like me, mental health care providers, as well as with the other folks that are intersecting with your children and grandchildren, right? At their school, at their doctor, OT, speech therapy, right? So what this leads to then is it requires us to challenge our understanding of autism. And so what I've got here on the left is the DSM-5 criteria. You know, how is it that clinicians typically look at diagnosing our children and grandchildren, right? Versus a strengths-based understanding of the criteria. And I've cited, you know, who we credit here in terms of documenting this. Matt Lowry was really helpful with this. So, for example, number one criteria, abnormal social approach and a failure of back and forth conversation. When we looked at it from a strengths-based standpoint, the way that we see it clinically, and when I sit with my clients, is a tendency to talk passionately about certain topics. There's a disinterest in engaging in small talk, and sometimes a frustration or an anger in engaging in small talk. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interactions. When we're looking at it from a strengths-based standpoint, is that, yeah, there are differences in nonverbal communication, that they may avert their eye contact, you know, instead of maintaining eye contact, or they may stare more intensely, that they may stim while talking or while feeling bored instead of interrupting the person about a topic that they're not interested in. Number three, deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. You know, looking at that and saying, hey, due to differences in communication, autistics tend to be shunned by neurotypicals. So again, this is us saying, instead of seeing the autistic person as the problem, it's, hey, listen, maybe neurotypical folks are not understanding well enough what the needs and experiences are, and therefore are more likely to bully autistic children. Insistence on sameness and flexible adherence to routines. I will say this as a neurodivergent woman and the mother of an autistic child, there is security in routines, right? It's not that my daughter is rigid and wants to control everybody. She's trying to control her internal experience because it feels so overwhelming sometimes. And so routines offer that comfort when maybe other parts of her life don't offer comfort. And then the last piece, highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. The strengths-based view here is due to hyper-connected brains, autistic folks may feel more passionately about their special interests, leading to fawning and fixations. I will tell you, in my career counseling work, the discussion around special interests is so cool. I have learned more about some hyper niche topics that I would never learn about because my clients have spent 20, 30 years studying them, sometimes getting master degrees in these topics, right? So when I see this from a strengths-based standpoint, I can't help but experience hope and optimism about how much can be brought to our world, to our economy, by bringing such a passion and a depth and breadth of interest about a topic. I'm sure all of y'all are familiar with this, so I'm not going to overburden y'all with it. But I think in terms of the conversation about a spectrum, any chance that I have to be able to talk about it, I will. There has been a misperception that the spectrum is more linear, and therefore some of the language around like my daughter is high functioning autistic or low functioning, it actually is quite reductive to the actual experience. And so this multifaceted, I almost like to think of it as like a gem. Like if you think of all the facets of the autistic experience, everything from emotional intensity, which many of us as caregivers have probably experienced that, right? The experience of, uh, I can't go to school. I can't even talk. I've been melting down for 3 hours and then come to find out it's because the underwear were itchy, right? So that connects things like proprioception, right, and exteroception with emotional intensity. Communication differences. Some of our children can mask, which we'll talk a little bit about. They'll mask a little bit more by scripting. So they'll have like set ways that they will enter into a conversation with other children. Or you may find that the way that they're always going to start play is by saying, I want to play tag, right? But they may struggle with things like imagination play. We've talked a little bit about the eye contact, the echolalia, verbal stimming can show up in a lot of different ways, right? And obviously, depending on their sense of comfort or distress, that can show up differently. Executive functioning differences in terms of hyper focus, process complexity. I don't talk too much about demand avoidance or persistent demand for autonomy in this presentation, but it is something that we're starting to learn a lot more about in terms of the importance of the autistic individual being able to feel like they have mastered their sense of autonomy and body and how that shows up in their interactions. And then obviously stims and spins. I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with this. And so I share this visual in case it's helpful for any of y'all, if you're helping educate other people in school, church, temple, whatever, to help them understand more about your child and how it shows up for them. I'm sure if you look at this wheel, the way that you look at it for the child that you love looks quite different than how I think about it for my daughter, where the gradients might be brighter on certain things and lower on others, for each of our children. So different for autistic girls. And I would love, if anybody has anything to add to this, right? Because this is based off of my clinical experience and lots of research, and also just being the number one advocate for my child. So the first thing is there's a lot more conversation happening about masking and camouflaging, which I'm super grateful for, because this demands a lot of energy for autistic girls and women. So, the stereotype of autistic folks is that they struggle with empathy, that they don't have emotions. And that certainly is and can be an element of some autistic profiles. What we're actually seeing in the research and in clinical experience is that a lot of autistic girls have high affective empathy, but where they may struggle is the practical language in expressing it, right? So they may feel a flood of emotion because they see their best friend crying, but they may struggle with, what do I say or do with that? Speech therapy can be helpful for that, right? I mentioned scripting earlier. So I have clients that even in therapy, when we've been working together for over a year and we, by all objective measures, have a strong sense of rapport with one another, they still will begin the session with about 5 minutes of scripting. These are the things that I think I need to focus on, boom, 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 boom. And then once the script runs out, one of my clients will even tell me I ran out of my script, right? And that's okay. That's something that is a part of their process because they have received messages that in order to be seen as normal, they need to be able to participate in a certain type of verbal conversation. That also, by the way, I mentioned the play aspect. So if your child is, I use tag because that's one of them that seems to be the most popular in terms of, okay, it seems that other children like this. I can play tag. So that's the game that I want to play. And it's really hard when it seems like they shifted from tag to hide and seek, right? But they might have been masking in terms of using that script of playing tag when they would have preferred to be playing something else or talking about butterflies for an hour. Intense eye contact, potentially even staring. This is based off of, it's really breaking that stereotype that autistic children only want to look away. There are some children that look away. And honestly, I think that's great. If that's what helps them focus on what's happening, instead of thinking, I need to maintain eye contact. Am I doing eye contact right? They're actually doing what their brain needs to do. But you may see with autistic girls that they're staring. An intense focus on perfectionism and people pleasing, a very wide range of vocabulary, skill, and IQ. I know many of us all together on this call understand that our children may be gifted in some things and in other things need a bit more support, right? But this perception that, all autistic girls also have IQ deficits, it's not accurate. And even if they do have IQ differences on the lower end, it does not mean that they are less worthy or less valuable. The role playing friendship. So, several of my clients study movies and shows and try to understand why and how girls, teenage girls interact the way they do at a volleyball game versus in class versus outside of school. Right. So really trying to understand the nonverbal cues, working really hard to study what it means to be neurotypical and then trying to almost mimic those. In terms of special interests and fixations, this can look wildly different depending on the girl, right? And also as the adult. So part of why a lot of autistic girls fall between the cracks and get diagnosed so late is because their fixations may appear more socially acceptable, or if anything, may seem very advanced or gifted. So winning art competitions, doing fashion design or interior design by the age of like 5 years old, maintaining super detailed collections of coins or stamps, butterflies, insects, right? Or studying animals. This really challenges that perception. I know like the stereotype is about trains, right? Which absolutely, like that's a real special interest and a fixation for some autistic folks, but these are some other ways that they show up. And I think the other thing is that due to the masking factor that I just mentioned, learning how to hide or be less disruptive when fixating is something that we are seeing is quite common with girls. So when I am working with women that have been diagnosed late, like in their 30s, and they're like, I have completely suppressed my special interest because I got signals really early on that people didn't appreciate hearing it or that I made them feel awkward. And so it becomes almost like a private spin for them instead of being able to integrate it into their day-to-day. The last thing that I wanted to highlight is as it relates to anxiety and stimming. So oftentimes, and I'm sure some of y'all have experienced this, is that the autistic child in your life was misdiagnosed first as having some form of an anxiety disorder. So what's most common is generalized anxiety disorder or social anxiety, which is certainly a component of the autistic experience. But when you're only being treated for the anxiety and you're the mental health therapist, if they're using a non-neurodivergent affirming approach to CBT, is they're basically saying that thought is irrational. Let's just change the behavior. When the fact is, the thought isn't irrational if your sensory experience is completely overwhelmed, or if you feel like, why did all the other girls seem to get some sort of playbook for how to be girls and I didn't, right? They may fight the urge to sim or fixate, even though it would soothe the anxiety and stress, simply to prevent the discomfort in others. And this is that societal pressure of being nice, keeping it pretty, be quiet, right? Instead of, doing your hands the way that you want to stim, or being more disruptive with your fidget toy. They might be more likely to hide it and therefore internalized disorders or behaviors like nail biting, the skin picking. They may quietly line up and over categorize things, or even disordered eating behaviors. We're seeing a real increase in the between disordered eating. Some of that may be due to sensory challenges, right? And some of that may be due to the fact that when it feels like the whole world is overwhelming and unaccommodating, well, maybe my eating is the one place where I can exercise some autonomy. All right, so someone asked about Temple Grandin. I Couldn't help but have her on here. Guys, autistic girls and women make the world a better place. Like, it is just, it's so cool. Like she is certainly the most prominent autistic woman in terms of her impact to the livestock industry and the amount of awards that she's won, and the documentary about her. I just encourage that you expose yourself to some of her perspectives, because when you think about her age and the fact that she was a woman in the livestock industry having conversations about animal cruelty, I mean, talk about the criticality of taking a different perspective and understanding and empathizing in a different way than neurotypical folks do. I wanted to also show you other normal women, right? Like folks that aren't winning awards yet but are making a difference. This woman, Angela Andrews, she works for Johnson and Johnson, and she wrote a think piece and has written on LinkedIn and some other things about how the way her unique brain works is actually like a huge value add. And she does not gloss over the fact that it was so hard to get through college, and that there have been challenges in her career, and that it was hard to interview, and the challenges of discrimination once at the workplace, right? So anytime you can get that fair and balanced perspective, not making it seem like it's all, rose through rose-colored glasses, but hey, like there should be optimism here because the way our brains work is incredible. I don't know if y'all have seen the hit Netflix series Love on the Spectrum. Kaylin was on that. There's also some incredible advocacy happening on LinkedIn, which is typically a platform where people are less likely to share their personal experiences. And I've really loved seeing some of the education. I don't agree with all the perspectives, but the fact that there are conversations happening is huge. And I wanted to actually point out Dr. Maureen Dunn. She wrote a book, The Neurodiversity Edge. She is a cognitive scientist and she is a consultant. She works with companies to help them evaluate their degree of neurodiversity in leadership and throughout the ranks. Is neurodivergent herself, and she just gives me so much hope on the corporate side of things in terms of challenging perspectives of autism, ADHD, dyslexia. She just does an incredible job of educating. I would be remiss if I did not mention Kate Kale. If you guys have not seen her TED Talk about autistic girls and why they often go undiagnosed, I highly recommend that you watch this. She was only 20 years old when she gave this talk. Her TED Talk has received, I think it's over 3 million views at this point across YouTube, Facebook. She's been featured on podcasts. At 17 years old, her art was featured at the DMA in New York. So, I mean, you want to talk about someone who understood early on, thanks to her diagnosis and the advocacy of her parents, she understands how her unique perspective is important for the world. And I share this with you, not because I think all of our daughters are going to be like presidents or, world leaders, right? Like we also need folks everywhere that are neurodivergent, demonstrating their skills and unique perspectives in different ways. But there's so many people that are changing the conversation. And the conversation shows up not just in podcasts and journals and TV shows, but also just in quiet lunches with friends and family, right? Or I had a client come and tell me that one of her coworkers shared with her about her diagnosis and how it showed up for her. That stuff matters, right? And that gives me hope. So, strengths-based support, what can we do as caregivers? Number one and number two are completely within our control as caregivers, okay? This is based on that understanding that for most of the day, for most of the moments, the autistic children in our lives experience the world as overwhelming, unaccommodating, and oftentimes pretty scary. And so the more that we can be that safe, affirming place at home, the better they're going to do at school, the better they're going to do at occupational therapy or in church or at temple, right? And so, continuing education, there are some fantastic support groups. I think it's amazing that you guys are joining this on Fridays. AANE, also, I have a link for that in this presentation. They have some excellent support groups for parents, or if you're an adult that suspects you're neurodivergent, or if you're married to a neurodivergent partner. So many different support groups. Connecting with organizations like the Autism Community Network obviously is a huge resource, for Texas. And there are so many organizations that you can also connect with, which I've included in here. There's some great podcasts. And then I also encourage you, if you are anything like me and you hyperfixate on research, I know a lot is happening in Instagram and TikTok. I would encourage you to, if you feel validated for some of the things you see in social media, I would encourage you to go to research journals, right? And try to fact check some things. Because there are some questionable things out there, but overall, I am glad that social media is like helping increase more awareness. But if you like research, check out some of the publications that I included in this deck. And then number 2, personal reflections and skills. If you need therapy, right? Because it is tough. It is tough being the primary caregiver and advocate sometimes. And then when you're also navigating your own neurodivergence or your own anxiety or trauma, able to explore that with a therapist that is supportive and understanding. There's also coaches that are out there. Support groups are also helpful here. And then journaling. For those of y'all that like to practice mindfulness, being able to spend 5 minutes a day reflecting on, hey, when I started to think about my child's averted eye contact, not as disrespect, but actually my way of allowing them to stim. And I noticed then that they listened to my instructions better when I let them avert their eye contact. Those types of reflections through journaling, or if you do voice notes for journaling, are really helpful. 3, advocacy. We spend so much time advocating for our children with doctors. Some doctors don't believe that our children have autism. They think it's something else. Or I've had the call from, regarding the IEP plan. They think they need to pull one of the supports. And I'm like, well, she's doing better because the supports are working, right? So there's all of that advocacy with our children's schools and organizations. But gosh, guys, having those family, sharing some of the things that you learned today and what you're reflecting on, that's huge. And participating in the PTA, I know it's hard. Like, we're all working multiple jobs. None of us have time. But if there is an opportunity through community events or the PTA to try to represent, what your child needs and how they experience the world, I have found that to be very helpful. Diversity affirming resources, identifying them for your children, mental health counselors, play therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, registered dietitians. There's actually a whole movement of registered dietitians for neurodiversity that takes sensory differences, that takes persistent demand for autonomy into account with how they solve for feeding issues with children. So there are some great ways that we can support our children with very practical resources. So what does it look like to be neurodivergent, affirming, in mental health care? So for me, it's as soon as I meet with a client, it's, hey, what do we need to change in my office to feel comfortable? Closing the shades. Do you want to sit crisscross applesauce on the floor while we talk? That type of stuff. I talk a lot about eye contact because for me, I'm like, if you need to stare out my window the whole session while we talk, let's do it. Asking how stimming fits into their day when struggling with a stressful topic and encouraging that stimming in appointment if possible, and finding practical ways for their special interests to be integrated in their career. So really quick, here's why like the early intervention and the education that y'all do matters. Lower rates of co-occurring diagnoses. If your child right now is diagnosed with autism level 2, generalized anxiety, and social phobia, it doesn't mean that their whole life has to be completely overwhelmed by social experiences, that we can help reduce the rates of anxiety and the intensity of depression, that we can prevent eating disorders and ultimately decrease the rates of suicide attempts and deaths by suicide. These are the things that are happening as a result of neurodivergent affirming care. Decreased risk and impact of trauma. Some of y'all may or may not know that autistic girls are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience abuse and trauma than neurotypical girls. And this increases dramatically for LGBTQ plus and BIPOC girls. So ensuring that we are being aware of the risk of abuse, the risk of bullying and sexual and online exploitation, not to infantilize our girls, right? Not that we need to be overly controlling and not let them do things and go hang out with friends, but we need to be able to look at people in their environment and have that spidey sense of, that's a tricky person. I don't like how they're interacting with my daughter. How do I help her develop skills to navigate things? And then how do I step in to prevent things from happening? And then if something does happen, if you notice the signs of increased nightmares, they started bedwetting, self-injurious behavior, or increased sexual sensory seeking, that you know how to speed up the process to get care, right? So helping them be resourceful, develop those discernment skills about tricky people, right? It's not just about the guy that's offering candy in the van. It's also about the person that keeps touching you on the thigh at school, right? Giving them safe spaces to increase their sense of autonomy and to know how to have a boundary. That guess what? No one else deserves to get to touch you unless we're at the doctor's office and they specifically ask for your consent and mommy's consent, right? So those types of things are important. And then the other thing is, you getting involved so early in your child's life, they're going to have more fulfillment and life satisfaction. The more that they have that sense of self-acceptance, the more that they're able to reflect on their life and how they fit in, and the more resources that they have, the better they'll be able to express their needs, their hopes, their skills, their desires, have better relationships and better work outcomes. This is all backed by research, guys. And so this link here, these are all of the scientific journals that I use for the basis of my practice. I would encourage y'all to read them. I also have provided links for all of these resources here, and I have so many more. So if you got